Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon, and I'm solo today in my interview with veteran war correspondent Elijah Magnier. Elijah is a journalist and a senior political risk analyst with over 32 years' experience covering Europe and the Middle East. Today he's speaking to us from Damascus, and here is that interview. Welcome, Elijah. It's great to see you again.
Thank you, Joanna. Thank you for having me again.
Just so everyone knows, Elijah is in Damascus right now, which I hope is a little bit quieter now that the situation in Duma is beginning to resolve. I saw some things this morning on the deal. A deal has finally been struck. I was wondering if you could give us a quick update on the latest developments.
Well, Ghouta became a nuisance for the Syrian government because it was used as an area in the back of Damascus. It is situated east of Damascus, and it can be linked to Al-Badia, the Syrian steppe where the Americans have forces and where it is easy to supply the area with what they need. And this is what used to happen during the years of war. And because the Russians are determined to end the war in Syria, or at least to establish an area where there are the Turks and there are the Americans in the north of the country, and that will not prevent the election to happen in case the United Nations or the Syrian government agree to run the elections. So the main issue was to prevent the election of happening in Syria, and this is where the Americans put pressure a lot on the Lebanese government, on Turkey, and on Jordan to prevent all the refugees from returning home and returning to their homes in Syria, and to just justify why the elections can't be run in the country. And on the other hand, the Syrian government was trying to remove all the jihadists, because we have a different group of jihadists around Damascus, east of Damascus, and we have others in the south. They're still there, but now we're talking about Duma and Zamalka and Ain Tarma. All this area is cleared now because this is where the jihadists used to shell the capital, giving an obvious right idea about the instability in the capital, and where it is not possible to run an election in a country where the capital is under constant rocket attacks. And in the last month, there were over 1,000 rockets falling on the capital and tens of kills and wounded in the city. So this is where the government was trying to create a balance with these people. But what happened is, according to my information, is when the Americans attacked Deir ez-Zor, and they have attacked the Syrian army and its allies trying to cross the river to attack ISIS that is still under the U.S. protection in the northeast Syria, and the Americans reply very harshly, killing above 100 persons, and they've left around 250 wounded. This is where Russia said, okay, it's time to retaliate indirectly, as it is always an indirect war in Syria, and it's really a game where the Syrians are playing the price between the superpowers. And the turn came to Ghouta, and Ghouta needs to be cleared, and it's cleared now. The only problem remains is Jaish al-Islam, because it's a jihadist pro-Saudi group, and the Saudis, until very recently, were still holding on to this group. And this is where the U.S. government, establishment, and the mainstream media supported these people and wanted them to stay in that area. So the Saudis are happy, and the elections in Syria can't be run. This is where the Syrian government and their Russian allies decided to remove all the jihadists, regardless of the Saudi position, And this is what's happening today. So they've started with the area of Arbil, Zamalka, and Tarma, etc. And now they've moved to Douma, and the evacuation of Douma started 2 days ago with the first jihadist group that escaped from the area of Arbil into Douma. And I think it's around 1,100 of Faylaq al-Sham. And today, the Jaish al-Islam are on the buses. The first group have left already, around 650. The buses went in Douma again this evening because it's already dark in Damascus. And they will keep taking on board all the pro-Saudi Jaish al-Islam and their families willing to leave to Turkey, to the Turkish-controlled area in Jarablus, and that is going to take a few more days. Now, the problem with Jaish al-Islam is nobody wanted them because they had no friends. They clashed with Al-Qaeda for dominance over the area, and they've clashed with other pro-Al-Qaeda jihadists. Therefore, they had nowhere to go. So I believe we heard about contacts between Saudi Arabia and Turkey to accommodate these fighters because nobody wants them anymore. The war in Syria is going to another direction now, and the war of proxies is coming to an end. And this group of 10,000, more or less 10,000 militants, they have to go somewhere. So Turkey accepted to take them on board, and I think they will recycle their brain to make them more Muslim Brotherhood than Wahhabi, pro-Saudi. So, and they use them in the north of Syria because the time will come for Al-Qaeda to be removed by the Turkish forces and their Syrian allies, because Russia told Turkey if they're not going to dominate the area under Al-Qaeda, they're going to move in. So Turkey moved in around the northern city of Idlib and the rural area, and they are trying to contain Al-Qaeda and the Ahrar Sham and other Turkish proxy Syrian groups are fighting against Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda is again splitting, but they still more or less of the same ideology. So this is what's happening in Douma, and the area of the eastern Ghouta on the whole is over. This battle is over, it's finished.
Well, that's good news for Damascus, but it's quite confusing, moving the Jaish al-Islam to Jarablus and having Turkey coming down, taking more and more territory in northern Syria. So the aspect of it that you just described, I hadn't heard before, where the reason why Turkey is moving is to amass forces to overwhelm, to defeat Al-Qaeda.
It's also to defeat Al-Qaeda, but not exclusively for that. Turkey wants to occupy the north of Syria, and the Aleppo used to be a long time ago the capital of the Ottoman Empire, the industrial capital of the Ottoman Empire. And Turkey wanted Aleppo. But when the war in Aleppo started later, after 2011, it was only in mid-2012 when Syrian Turkish proxies in rural area of Aleppo moved to the city and pushed Aleppo to be involved in what they called the revolution or the proxies war in Syria. And Turkey tried to take Aleppo. They've emptied quite a lot of industry and fabrics from Aleppo. And when Aleppo returned to the control of the Syrian central government, this is where Turkey is happy now to take a part of Syria in the north. And it is taking Afrin, that is the Kurdish-controlled, used to be the Kurdish-controlled area. And it is in Jarablus, Al-Bab, and in Idlib, and around Idlib. And they're still trying to move on and trying to persuade the Americans to accept to move away from Manbij to move in. Now, Jaish al-Islam were not pro-Turkish, but because they have a lot of money, I mean, they've asked to take with them $900 million and this is a small wealth they have accumulated throughout the years from their supporter, Saudi Arabia, and they wanted to take with them this money, but the request was denied. But I think Saudi Arabia will either continue supporting them or Saudi Arabia will just drop them in the hands of Turkey and forget about Syria. And I think Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudi crown prince, said, Assad is staying, it means the war in Syria is over for him and he can't change anything anymore. Qatar said that before him, and the Qatari foreign minister said, we've lost the war, we have to acknowledge it, and we have to stop and leave. So it took Saudi Arabia a bit longer to accept this kind of defeat, and now they have accepted it, and it's no longer present in Syria.
So Jaish al-Islam are somewhat stranded.
Yes, they had nowhere to go. They tried. They asked if they go to the Kalamoun, the eastern Kalamoun area, because there's still an area in Jabrud. It is Dumair. It's close to Mu'addamiyya. So it's a bit north of Ghouta and east of Malula. And this area is still not under the Syrian government control, but there are talks with the inhabitants to keep this area safe and not to be involved in any attacks against the Syrian government or the Syrian army. And the Jaish al-Islam wanted to go there, and their request was refused, was denied. And they had nowhere to go because they fought against Al-Qaeda, because they have different objectives, not a different ideology, and they can't go anywhere really. So the only way to go was Turkey, the area under the Turkish occupation.
So they are going to have to sort of become part of the FSA, the Free Syrian Army?
Or leave to Turkey and become refugees, or drop their weapons, or because now they were allowed to leave only with light weapons. When in Douma they have tanks, they have artillery, they have heavy weaponry, they have anti-tank missiles, laser-guided missiles, all that they have to drop and leave behind. So they have no chance but to join Turkey or to just drop their weapons and stop fighting.
Now, did all of them leave, or did some of them agree to disarm and stay in their homes?
Some agreed to stay in Douma and not leave. So far we have at least we have thousands of militants who decided to stay in Douma, like in many other parts of Syria, and reconcile with the Syrian government. And this happened a bit everywhere. But the majority is leaving. The civilians, the majority of the civilians are divided in two parts. There are the families of the militants, and there are civilians who want to leave and the civilians who want to stay. Those who want to stay, they're going to stay. It happened in the same Ghouta in the last weeks, and people remained in their home and didn't leave. So in Douma, we will have the same case.
When the militants decide to lay down their arms and reconcile with the Syrian government, are they conscripted at that point into the Syrian army?
No, they have another force on the side of the Syrian army, and it is called Kaddish. And this force is made of all the ex-rebels that fought against the government for one reason or another, for money, for lack of jobs, for protecting their family, to be part of those who benefit the most of the financial support from donors, or the food and food supply from non-governmental organizations. And to be part of armed group, it gives you the upper hand on normal civilians, and that happens in every war. So not only ideologists or freedom fighters, or those who want to change something are the ones who carry weapons. There are those who just carry the weapon with whoever is in control of the ground.
Right, that makes sense. All right, well, it's good to know that they're not lobbing shells into Damascus every day, as was happening before. Did you see any of that when you were there? You've been there a while, right?
Oh yeah, plenty. Mm-hmm. It's on a very regular basis.
Yeah, I don't know how you do that. You've spent so much time and decades in war zones. I think it would be terrifying.
During the war, wherever you are in any country, if there is a real battle that happened 100 meters away with clashes, RPG, everything, and you are, let's say, 100 meters in a parallel street, people walk in that street normally because they get used to that. I mean, you just need to avoid the street where there is the clash, and you just don't go there when groups start fighting. That's in civil war. But when you have rockets, you just don't need to think about it. If it happened that you are there and the rocket fall, then you are there. You can't, either you stay at home and you don't move, or you quit this kind of job, or you just go in the street and understand what's happening. You need to be in contact with the people, feel like a people, and understand if they struggle to find bread or find gasoline, or people will queue all day to look for, food in the supermarket. Or it happened in many places around the globe. And every war is more or less the same in some aspect and different in other aspects. And if you don't stay with the population, you stay in a hotel, so you rely on who? On the news, or on the taxi drivers, or on rumors. There are thousands of rumors per day. How can you select? You just go on the street and find out for yourself.
Yeah, that's the thing with the Western media, is we get most of our reports or dispatches from Beirut, and there's so few people actually in Syria on the ground that I think it's easy to pull one over on those journalists. I don't know if they really understand what's going on or not, or what their sources are. They tend to always be the pro-rebel forces who, tell them whatever they want.
I think if they rely on pro-rebels, it's not a problem, because this is one side of the story. But then they have to hear the other side. And if they don't, at least they have to look for real rebels, not activists. Because activists, they have their own agenda and they can twist the reality. And we still read, even in Ghouta, the last doctor and the last hospital that have been going on in the last 6-7 years of war. It's so boring.
The same talking points, the same script, they just run it over and over again.
Yeah, change only the name of the city.
Yeah, I've seen it myself now. Mm-hmm. So your recent article, the 3-part article titled, "Will America Accept Its Defeat, or Will It Challenge the Russian Bear and the Chinese Dragon?" This was really a good article. You put a lot of work into this, and your articles are always good, but you took the time to sort of lay out, to give a high-level view, to describe all the power players and what they want and what they're trying to do. And I think that was particularly valuable. So I pulled out a few clips, if you don't mind if I read some quotes from here, and we can sort of discuss those so that we can fit a lot of this into a short period of time. I want to leave a little time at the end to talk about the book that you're writing. So in the first article, you talk a little bit about what's next. And of course, this is just a list of bullet points, but they all expand into a much bigger story. So the first one you talk about is the Yarmouk camp and the Hajar, I'm sorry, I'll really botch this, Hajar al-Aswad. And yes, those are ISIS and Al-Qaeda pockets south of Damascus, between Damascus and Israel, the Israeli border. And then the second one that you list is the Syrian steppe, al-Badiyah. I found this one particularly interesting. There are pockets of ISIS, I guess, here. The third one is Idlib and Al-Qaeda. Number 4 is the Turkish occupation forces in the north of Syria. Number 5 is the U.S. occupation forces in Deir ez-Zor and al-Asaka. And then number 6 is Daraa and Quneitra. So tell us a little bit about each one of these, and then we can expand on it. So the first one would be Yarmouk.
Okay. Before I start with each one of these, I would like to say just very quickly something about the war in Syria. The war in Syria is not the war in Syria, and it is not Syria that is concerned. Syria is only a battlefield. And this is why I went a bit far from Syria to look at the Syrian map and to look at the Middle East and Asia and the US and Russia and Iran, and look how the main players are playing just to confirm their dominance over the certain areas where they can play. And it happened that everybody is playing on one ground and one territory, and it happened they all come to Syria to unite and do their game, which is a very deadly game and very destructive game. This is why I tried in my article to say, okay, in the Yarmouk camp, south of Damascus, we have two groups fighting. We have ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda are making a deal with the government and the central government in Damascus and saying, we want to leave because they are losing ground in favor of ISIS, and they want to go to Idlib. And the Syrian government is very happy to take them on green, and now we have green and white buses because there aren't enough green buses in Syria anymore for the large number of jihadists and militants leaving. So it's very happy to take them to Idlib, where they can just pile on top of each other in one city, where they have to run the water, the electricity, the management of the city, the infrastructure, and then the gain power in between all these groups. They have different ideology, different way of thinking, different objectives, or no objectives, because they've lost all their objectives now. They just cornered in one area. And ISIS is the same. ISIS is prevailing over Al-Qaeda in Hajar al-Aswad and Yarmouk camp, which is south of Damascus. But if ISIS controlled the entire area of Hajar al-Aswad and Yarmouk, and Al-Qaeda leaves, then what? ISIS is completely surrounded. ISIS has no place to go. They can just leave them and they will starve inside the camp by just shelling them without making any effort or losing any men. The Syrian government and the Syrian army can just destroy ISIS with time until all the other areas that are more important are cleared. That's one way. That's one option. The second option is just to bombard the camp. And I think the Syrian government is very keen and tempted to bombard the camp because it used to be occupied by Palestinians and under the control of Hamas. And the position between the Syrian government and Hamas is not very good these days because Hamas took the side of ISIS, took the side of Al-Qaeda, and then went to Qatar, a country that has invested billions of dollars in the misery of the Syrian population and the destruction of Syria. Therefore, to reconcile with Hamas, particularly the political leadership, is not something that the Syrian government is keen to do. So destroying that area and that camp is not a bad idea from the Syrian government point of view. Now, it is moral, immoral, what's the lesson behind it is none of my business and neither my decision. But I'm just saying that is one possibility. And the other possibility is to isolate ISIS. The second place is Al-Badia, which is the Syrian steppe.
Can you describe where that is?
It is in the east of Syria, in the east of the country. If you look at the area between the Iraq and Syria, that desert, that looks like a desert, but it's not a desert. Yeah.
Okay. Where is it in relation to the river? Is it on the eastern side of the river?
It's south of the river. If you have the Syrian map in front of you and you go down in the area of Al-Tanaf where the Americans are, because if you go down Deir ez-Zor, you have the area of Al-Tanaf where the crossing between Syria and Iraq, and this is where the Americans occupy that area.
Yeah, so I know where Al-Tanaf is.
Yes, exactly. So if you look at these north of Al-Tanaf, northeast of Al-Tanaf, and if you go up from Tadmur, which is Palmyra, toward Al-Bukamal or Al-Mayadin.
Okay.
So it's between Palmyra and Al-Mayadin.
All right. Yeah,
there is a pocket of ISIS there, just after As-Sukhna.
Okay. I see Al-Sukhna along the M20.
So it's east of As-Sukhna. This is a pocket that is under ISIS control.
I see.
It is a bit far from the Iraqi borders and far from As-Sukhna, but it's between this area. So this is where there are thousands of Syrian army troops, and they're all surrounding it.
Interesting. So we're talking the steppe actually, that geographical type of land continues into Jordan, I guess, and Iraq.
If you go down really, very down south of Syria, on southeast of Syria, you will see Suwaida, the Suwaida province. It's above the Suwaida province until Al-Bukamal. This is all the steppe.
Gotcha. I gotcha.
And in that steppe, you have the Tanaf in the middle, and then you have ISIS pocket above it. So the northeast at Tanaf.
All right. And the other, just to preview a little bit of what you said later on in the article, is this is an oil-rich area.
Yes, it is an extremely rich area. And this is where the Russians are exploiting the oil today, bringing new equipment and new drilling machines to increase the Syrian oil production and to support a little bit the Syrian economy.
Now, it's funny because in the past, people used to talk about this part of Syria as just, it's just desert. It's, there's nothing there that anyone wants. I had not known, or I missed somewhere along the line, that this was a very valuable area.
It is.
Because of the energy resources. And you say later on in these articles that Syria could actually rival Iraq and Iran with the amount of resources, untapped resources that they have.
Yes.
Now that's amazing. I did not know that. And I don't think anybody ever talks about that.
Yes, because in 2010, a Canadian ship went over the entire Mediterranean Sea with all the necessary equipment to study the topography and to look for the potential of oil and gas in the area. And what they found out, this is how they found out about the oil and gas in Lebanon and in Cyprus and in Syria.
Yeah, the big gas field out in the eastern Mediterranean that everybody's fighting over now.
Yes, correct. And the result is that they consider the area opposite Tartus and the Syrian coast. It is one of the richest area in the entire region.
Now, what year was that they did that discovery?
In 2010.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it?
Yes.
That's interesting timing.
And they gave the report to the Syrian government, and the Syrian government didn't speak about it very much because it was thinking about how to sort out the maritime territory and limits between Lebanon and Syria and Turkey. And there was this offer from Russia and Iran to use the gas pipeline to compete with the one proposed by Qatar to supply Europe with gas. And this is one of the main reasons why there is a war in Syria, apart from the struggle of dominance of the superpower, which is always the same, is about energy. And the rejection of Bashar al-Assad to the Qatari plan pushed the country toward a war because Iran was winning this contract and Russia was part of it. And because gas used to be in 2010, 2011, represented 70% of the Russian economy, crippling this 70% will put Russia on its knees. And Europe is supplied with the Russian gas. And if Qatar offers an alternative cheaper than the one of Russia and an alternative of the one of Russia, then it would have been possible for the US to delay for many more years the growing of the Russian bear into a very strong nation, and not only a nation with only nuclear weapons. And this is what the Americans were afraid of. And this is what the Americans trying to delay all the time. I mean, we can talk about it a bit later if you want to finish the first part, but it's up to you.
No, we'll get to that later on. It's just, I just wanted to bring up, I don't know, I just found that very interesting part of your article. I wanted to mention that about this area that I thought was, somewhat worthless, but it's not at all worthless.
Yeah. And after that, you have Idlib and Al-Qaeda in Idlib. And the Russian made it very clear to the Turks. And they said, if you're not going to get rid of Al-Qaeda, we are moving in. And this is where the Syrian army, heavily supported by Russia and its allies, they've started to advance in rural Idlib. And they took until Abu Dhuhr area. And this is when Turkey agreed with Russia that they are going to move in. And they took position in many points in the rural area of Idlib. They stopped the advance of the Syrian army in agreement with Russia and Damascus, and they've started to push their proxies to fight Al-Qaeda, and this is what's happening. Yesterday they've started, the day before yesterday, a month ago, they were fighting, and Al-Qaeda was losing ground, and Al-Qaeda, what we know about Julani, is no longer the real Al-Qaeda, even if it is still not completely non-recognized by Al-Qaeda, because Al-Qaeda recognizes any group that represent the majority Sunni working for the benefit of the Sunni and holding the same ideology, more or less. Mm-hmm. Therefore, this area is going to be cleared by Turkey, and Al-Qaeda is no longer supposed to stay. And it's very possible for Al-Qaeda just to change its name or just to melt within the population and other group to wait for a better term and better time to raise again. And I don't think it's going to be a better time to raise in the Levant. It's over. They have to go to insurgency attacks or just to go to another area of jihad outside the Levant.
Well, Turkey, are they using their own military or strictly proxy forces that they're arming and supporting? And
they are using their own military, but in a smaller number, because they are elite special forces with armed brigades. But the main ground force is they are Syrians. They use the proxies to fight for them on their behalf, and they guide them. And this is why we see the Turkish casualties is very low.
How about where's the money and the weapons coming from?
For
the Turkish proxies fighting Al-Qaeda in Idlib?
Well, during the war, they have gathered a lot of money and a lot of weapons from all groups, including the United States. So there were groups that used to be supported by the U.S., financed by the U.S., armed by the U.S., Saudi Arabia invested a lot of money, Qatar invested a lot of money, and now Turkey is paying because Turkey is getting the benefit from the wealth of the land that is occupying. Afrin is a very wealthy area. That's why Turkey is not lacking money from the Syrian wealth.
That's interesting too. I'll let you continue with where are we? The Turkish occupation forces, the number 4.
Yeah. So the Turkey, it's a tricky one because I heard a lot, many sources in Damascus saying, well, between the Americans and the Turks, we prefer the lesser evil. And the lesser evil in this case is Turkey, not the Americans. Because the Americans can turn the Middle East upside down. They have a lot of money. They can bring money from the Saudis and make the Saudi pay on their behalf. They can turn people against each other. They can finance operation in different cities of Syria, and they can stay there for a very long time, and no one can force them because they can just simply ignore the United Nations resolution and veto any resolution against them, while Turkey can't do the same thing. And the Turks are against the Kurds, and the Kurds immediately believed or dreamt about a possibility to be independent, and that dream was since a long time haunting them. And the Americans said, hey, I'm here, I can make your dream come true. And this is why the Kurds follow the Americans, and the Kurds can be the punching bag for the Americans in front of the Syrian army or any other insurgent attack from the local population to free their land from the U.S. occupation. So this is why the Americans' presence is much more dangerous than the Turkish presence in Syria. And because of the Turkish-Russian good terms and good relationship and the Turkish-Iranian good relationship, the Syrian government has more possibility to talk to Turkey than to talk to the U.S. That's why the Turkish presence is not tolerated, but more tolerated than the American presence.
Yeah, I mean, they live there. They have an interest. It's their homeland, in the area.
And what helped really Turkey are the Kurds, because the Kurds in Afrin enclave refused to deliver the control of the enclave to the Syrian government. And the Syrian government said, we move in and we control the enclave, and Turkey will not attack you because we are working side by side with the Russians. And the Kurds said, you can come and protect our borders. And the Damascus said, you don't have borders. This is the Syrian border. This is not Afrin border. And the Syrian army refused to be the guardian of the Kurdish self-declared federation or mini-state. And the Kurds went all along by rejecting the Syrian government's offer to deliver the enclave to the Syrian army and to deliver the administration to the Syrian army. And at the end of the day, they have lost the enclave. They are now refugees. You have a couple of 100,000 refugees, including other refugees who came from many other areas during the war.
Right.
They've lost their homes to Turkey. And now the Syrian government needs to deal with Turkey, but at least they have a lesser evil who were the Kurds ready to join the Americans and declare the Rojava, the entire area of northern Syria, as a Kurdish state.
Yeah, I found it very confusing, the choice that the Kurds made in Afrin. It's almost as if they believed that Turkey wouldn't actually invade and occupy.
Well, I mean, the Kurds blamed Russia for that, and the SDF, with the Kurdish leadership, was created by the Americans. I don't know why Russia would protect a group supported by the Americans, and the Russia will support a piece of Syrian territory to the benefit of the Americans because the Kurds accepted it. And the Kurds worked not from the clever strategic approach, but from a purely wishful thinking of having a state too early, like the same Kurds did in Iraq, Barzani in Kurdistan, and they end up failing and losing everything. And this is what today Barzani was a little bit more clever than the Syrian Kurds who have lost their home. At least the Kurds in Kurdistan, they still have their home.
Yeah, up until now, the Kurds had managed to maintain a somewhat neutral position between the American side and the Syrian and Russian side. But I guess this is that point where they had to make a choice.
Well, the Kurds maintained not only a neutral side, but they supported the Syrian government and they supported the sieged Syrian cities when the jihadists were surrounding certain areas. But then when the Americans moved in, they've just said, okay, it's time for us to be independent. And they thought the whole world would support us because the whole world sympathized with our cause, which is true to a certain point.
Yes.
The world support the Kurds in their cause, but it doesn't support the American occupation forces of a Syrian territory and a forced occupation by the Kurds to declare and impose a state. Although there were many talks between the Kurds and the central government in Damascus about a kind of autonomy and a kind of federation, and the Syrian government accepted that. But the Kurds wanted a bit more, those were lost it all.
Yeah, and with the Kurds, Afrin was isolated from, this seems to be breaking down to, which side of the Euphrates River you're on. And Afrin was an isolated, always the isolated canton. And it just was pretty shocking the way it played out. So the last, I guess we didn't really talk about Deir ez-Zor and Hasaka.
No, we're coming to that.
Okay.
So, and then we have Deir ez-Zor and Hasaka. This is where the Americans are, Raqqa, Hasaka, Deir ez-Zor provinces in the northeast. And this is where this area is more or less 24% of the total Syrian territory. And there is a very large ISIS pocket protected by the U.S. forces because the U.S. forces said, we are no longer attacking ISIS now. And their excuse is because the Kurds are very busy with what's happening in Afrin. Well, now Afrin is over, and they're still very busy not attacking ISIS. And ISIS is producing a lot of material, propaganda material, showing how life is nice in that area and how there is water and how they can they continue teaching their ideology. They continue train on.
Are they recruiting?
Well, they recruiting from the locals, or they showing how they are training, military training, and giving Islamic lessons and ideology lessons in the area. I don't think they can recruit because nobody can travel to that area anymore, and ISIS became a loser now. Nobody is traveling there. So they're not recruiting from outside, but maybe they can convince some tribe close to them, but that's it. This is all what they can do. Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, we see ISIS is living in prosperity in that pocket, and that pocket is under the U.S. control. Now, no U.S. official is capable of answering the question, what on earth are you doing and why you are protecting ISIS? And they just ignore it, and mainstream media is not even talking about it. You don't find that in any newspaper, in any American newspaper, talking about ISIS pocket in northeast Syria. And it's a very big one. And to the point that the Iraqis are extremely upset because they're trying to invest many men on the borders to stop ISIS from crossing, because ISIS is exactly on the Syrian-Iraqi borders.
Really? Okay. So
yes.
Mosul, the whole Mosul thing where some of them left Iraq and went over to Syria. Is it that situation, or did they just always held this area?
Oh no, they were reduced to that area. They were holding the entire area. But what they did is when the Iranians, Mali, and Syrian allies moved to Al Bukamal and Deir Zur, and after that the Syrian army came in, the ISIS was there in these cities. And when they moved in, so ISIS immediately pulled out from Al Bukamal
Right.
towards the U.S. controlled area because they felt much safer. And indeed, the Americans didn't attack them while they were pulling groups, because when forces are retrieving and they are withdrawing, they are extremely vulnerable.
Right.
This is when it's the best possibility to attack. So I remember in Iraq when the American forces used to move troops from Basra to other part of the country, they used to close the highway completely and move by night because they are extremely vulnerable when they are moving, and they ask for a truce not to be attacked while they are moving and withdrawing because they are extremely vulnerable. The same with the Israelis when they pulled out from south of Lebanon in the year 2000. They did that during the night, so they're not under attack. Therefore, when ISIS was retrieving and withdrawing from Al-Bukamal, the U.S. Army did not attack them. Moreover, there was a deal between ISIS and the American forces in Raqqa,
Right.
where the BBC talked about thousands of ISIS who were allowed to leave to other areas in Syria and to Turkey or to other destinations, but they were allowed to leave. When the U.S. complained about a few hundred ISIS militants who were removed from the Syrian-Lebanese borders to Deir Zur to clean the Lebanese borders from ISIS. And they said, we don't allow terrorists to leave. And maybe they were referring because the number was less than thousands, because it was a few hundred. And they wanted a very big number because the Americans only accept thousands of ISIS to be relocated to other areas. And this is what they did, really. So they have relocated ISIS from Raqqa, and they have accepted the withdrawal of ISIS from Deir Zur and Al-Bukamal into the area under the U.S. control, and this is where they are. And this is why the Americans are considered by the Syrian government much more dangerous than any other country or force occupying the area, because the Americans are capable of doing illogical things, or the logic comes later, that they intend to allow this group to create havoc in Syria and in Iraq, which they are.
It sounds similar to Idlib too, though. Like, there were areas in northeast Syria that were reclaimed at, a really amazingly rapid pace. And clearly deals were made, and these people, the fighters and their families, either decided to change their alliance, or did they cut deals with them like the Syrians did with Idlib? Did the U.S. and the Kurds cut deals with people in these ISIS-controlled areas, and get them to agree to lay down their arms and to relocate to this ISIS pocket? Was it a similar situation? Did they choose to, instead of fighting for an area, they just allowed them to surrender and move?
The area in North Syria, like Dabek and all the other area that used to be under ISIS control, Turkey struck in the deal with ISIS, not the U.S. forces. The U.S. forces strike a deal with ISIS in Raqqa, and they have accepted them as under their protection in northeast Syria. In other part, the U.S. used to protect Al-Qaeda through the United Nations and through mainstream media by creating a storm around any Syrian army attack against Al-Qaeda. Also, there were many reports about how the U.S. Special Forces were training Syrian militants, and they were complaining by saying, we are training Al-Qaeda people, and we don't understand why. So, I don't think from the logical point of view, from the human side, no Americans would understand how the U.S. establishment is training Al-Qaeda responsible of 9/11. But from the dominance point of view, you can see that the U.S. establishment is using any force on any proxy, even if it is the enemy of the United States of America, to fulfill a certain objective, even if it is a temporary objective.
Right. And for people who aren't familiar with that, the article that Elijah is referring to is in SOFREP, S-O-F-R-E-P, by Jack Murphy. And he relates things that were said by, people he knows, members of the U.S. Special Forces training jihadis, and not happy at all about it. So, yeah, I think more Americans now do know that the ground forces, proxy ground forces that we are arming and training in Syria are, at times, are Al-Qaeda. But overall, I think that would just be a shocking fact to most Americans. It would be just a shocking fact. It's been floated in the foreign policy media. Like even David Petraeus actually brought it up as a, he tried to make an argument for it, but that didn't last long. They had to retreat from that. But yeah, I mean, it's indefensible here. And I don't see how it's ever going to be defensible. But they do, our army generals in the area do sometimes talk about converting people that were, they still go with it. Well, they weren't really extremists. They really were moderates, or they were coerced, and some of them are salvageable. But anyway, so
there is a difference between converting people, which I think I'm comfortable with it, and with supporting people who are still holding the same ideology and the same objective.
Yes, yeah.
Converting people is something good when people change their objective, their goal, and their idea from moving, not changing religion, but changing from being a radical to extremist, acting and capable of doing terrorist acts, and a radical who is radical, and it can be radical and he's happy to be radical. That's okay. But to train Al-Qaeda, to offer weapons to groups that are fighting with Al-Qaeda, to finance these groups and train them that they can transport the knowledge and the experience and the fighting, the know-how, that is dangerous.
Yeah,
that's
a whole different thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And if you look at the casualties of the Iraqi soldiers killed in Iraq, you see the highest were between 2003, 2004 to 2007. And then it started to drop because 2008, 2009, 10, 11, the U.S. were involved with the Sahwa. So therefore, they were converting people, buying them with money. But that was fine. That was okay, because that not only reduced the casualties, but also crippled the capability of terrorist organizations, and also provide a lot of intel and give support to the central government. That's okay. In Syria, it was not the case. Everything was directed against the central government. Everything in Syria was directed toward a regime change and toward a failed state where jihadists dominate the country.
Right. Yeah, recruited over to the regime change war, which supposedly is over now. The Saudis, I think bin Salman, publicly stated that Bashar al-Assad is going to stay. I'm not sure I believe him, but it has been proclaimed. So I guess we'll see.
Yeah, I think when he said that, even if too late, because his last militants were about to leave Douma, and there are no more pro-Saudis fighting in close to Damascus. But it doesn't mean Saudis don't have money to invest in Syria, because they are going to invest in the Kurdish area if the Americans remain and the words of the establishment prevails above the decision of the President Trump, who said he would like to leave Syria as soon as possible. But as soon as possible is very murky. We don't know what does as soon as possible mean. I mean, it can be in the next 10 years rather than in the next 100 years. We don't know.
Yeah, bin Salman also spoke about that. He said, we don't want the Americans to leave Syria in the midterm and possibly not in the long term. So pretty much everybody on the hawkish side is trying to counter Trump's statement that we're going to leave Syria he said very soon. And immediately there was an outburst against that. And lots of anonymous sources in the American media saying that Trump's advisors believe we can't leave. And then Lindsey Graham was on the Sunday News yesterday saying, the usual talking points, that we can't leave. He says there are 3,000 ISIS still to conquer. And he used some psychological manipulation on Trump too. He said that he told Trump that if he pulls out of Syria now, he'll be making the same mistake that Obama made in Iraq. And, you could see he's just messing with his mind. But they are clearly worried that Trump will continue to hold that opinion or will make a move. It's interesting times here. But Trump, it's unclear whether he just said that, whether he just was, going back to the script from his campaign rally days, or whether he really means that. He sounded like he meant it. Because he went on at length about how we spent $1 trillion and we got nothing for it, that, and how, you can get money to fight in the Middle East, but you can't get money to fix or build a school in Ohio. So he did elaborate on it. He didn't just sort of spit out a talking point. He went on about it. But it's still unclear how sincere he was.
Yeah, we don't know. I mean, he said many things during his campaign. Over 1,000, what was described as 1,000 lie, or over 1,000 lie in the first few months of his presence in office. So maybe he was not aware what he was saying just to reach the White House. And now he said it after his first experience in the White House. He said he wants to pull out of Syria. So let's see what is the excuse that he's going to offer to stay longer. But I mean, the excuse that we hear from the mainstream media is if you leave northeast Syria, you're going to leave that area to Iran, which is completely absurd because there is no road that leads to Iran from northeast Syria. There are a road between Iraq and Syria and Damascus, Tehran, Baghdad and Damascus. They're much closer than go all around Syria and go northeast and then down to Damascus. It's ridiculous. These people have no idea about the geography of Syria, or they just do that or say it just for the sake of writing an article, really.
Yeah, I think that is it. They boil it down to a simple concept. Oh, they're building a road from Tehran to Beirut. It's easier to communicate that than it is to explain the, really complicated situation that is reality. So, and then what about the area down near the Israeli border?
That's the most difficult area for now, because the Syrian army has a very small pocket in contact with the occupied Golan Heights that is occupied by the Israelis. And all the other area, it is a kind of jihadist natural buffer zone for Israel, where Israel is supplying jihadists, as Israel is saying, with weapons, intelligence, medical assistance, and everything they need for them to stay there. And from time to time, they are bombing the Syrian army, which since the downing of the Israeli jets are no longer doing it. So this area, it is part of the deconflict zone where the Americans, the Jordanians, the Israelis, and the Russians, they all were present, and they have agreed to keep this area neutral. Now, what the Syrian government is doing, the Syrian government since a few days, and now I can tell you, is starting a negotiation with the militant in Daraa to see if they can have a more open mind about where they are going to go next. Israel can't protect them for very long. Mm-hmm. And the rest of Syria, apart from the north, is just coming to more or less to an end. So a little bit between Hama and Homs, it's a small area. The eastern Kalamoun and the south of Damascus, they are small pockets. So the question the Syrian government is asking for the people of Daraa and the militant there is, what is your perspective? Where are you going to go next? Jordan has changed attitude, and Jordan considers dealing with the Syrian government now is a priority rather than protecting jihadists on the borders, on the Syrian borders. And they've closed the borders with Syria to make sure that there are no jihadists crossing to Jordan, because the jihadists are losing the war. And there are no more jihadist groups with the acknowledgement of General Votel that can make any difference in changing the Syrian regime or to turn the table upside down in Syria. It's finished. So this is the negotiation. It's ongoing now. And I think Syria and its allies, a bit less Russia, are determined to free Daraa and the area there. And they can do that. The Americans can't interfere because they have no presence there. And the Israelis can't interfere because the Syrian air defense system is ready for them if ever they violate the Syrian airspace.
What Israel wants is for those pockets to remain under the control of these rebel groups, right?
Israel wants the war in Syria to continue endlessly because that in Israeli approach would exhaust Iran and Hezbollah and the Syrian resources, where the Syrian army will be on its knee and Hezbollah will suffer knees, and Iran will invest a lot of finance in a country that is at war. Unfortunately for Israel, the war is coming to an end. The Syrian army is much more experienced today. Those who are fighting along the Syrian army are the only one who were fighting in Ghouta, by the way, without any ally. It was only a Syrian army operation. So the Syrian army is much more experienced. Those who are part of the Syrian army, they have a different ideology, different approach. They fought against jihadists. They fought in a classical war with Russia. They fought in urban warfare. They fought everywhere. And not only that, there are over 16 16 significant groups who are Syrian groups under the label of the Republican Guards, but they are national forces who represent a kind of the national Syrian resistance. And these are the trained, they have received much higher training than the Syrian army. Their training went above 1 year training in training camps. They have the experience of Hezbollah fighters. They have the classical army experience. They have all kinds of experiences in warfare. And these are the groups who mushroomed during the war, having a boomerang effect on Israel. Instead of seeing Syria completely crippled, now they have to deal with a new force that has emerged from the 7 years of war. And all these are ready now to take back not only Daraa, they want to take back the Golan Heights.
Yeah, I've seen that. I've seen that written. Since we're talking about Israel, in another part of the article you say, quote, U.S. presence makes it easier for Israel to use a U.S.-established airport in northeast Syria as a hub on the Syrian-Iraqi border. How does that fit into all of this?
There are American airports established in northeast Syria, in the area protected by the Syrian Kurds.
So like 13
And
bases
these
is the
airports,
last I've heard. But I think Turkey just said there are 20.
yes, but I mean, there are more than two functional military airports.
Oh, right.
Yeah, they can host all kind of American jets and aircraft.
The one
And
near Kobani is one of them, right?
Yes,
and is
correct.
the other one in that city right on the border? Where are the other ones?
I don't have it on the map now, but it's close to Al-Hasaka.
Okay, gotcha.
So the Americans are offering this facility to the Israelis where they can use that airport to move, to bomb different areas in Syria. So what the Russians saw, because the Russian managed to monitor the Israeli jets when they take off from the Israeli airports, not only when they cross the Israeli airspace into the Syrian airspace. And there were a few reports a few months ago that Israel was using the airport, the American airport in northeast Syria. And they can use that for special operation. They can use that to bomb the Syrian army. When they bombed the Syrian army in Palmyra and next to Sukhna, and this is where the Russians were extremely angry with the Americans because the agreement with the Americans that they will use that area, but not now they use it to another non-declared country, and which is not part of the coalition that formed the war against terror. And this is when the Russians started to deliver to the Syrian army a different kind of anti-air missiles and help them with what they can see on their radars to inform them what the Israelis are planning when they want to cross the Syrian airspace.
I see. Let's see. I don't want to keep you too long. Let me skim through here for some of the. Let me just pick out a couple of things. Let's go to the bigger picture now, which is the point of the 3-part article that you wrote. And you say that, quote, both Russia and China are now working closely to put an end to the unipolar superpower and thus end U.S. world dominance. And you say that, quote, I'm skipping around here. This is from a different part of it. Quote, the U.S. estimated that Russia by the year 2020, would be too strong militarily and economically to be isolated or weakened. This is why Washington tried its best to surround Russia and cut its legs off much before and close the oceans to its commerce and its Chinese ally. And then in another quote, you say, quote, Iran is ready for a partnership with Europe, but rejects U.S. dominance. With or without the nuclear deal, Iran is heading toward a wide partnership with Russia and China. Beijing needs a reliable source of energy, an exit to the oceans, and a window to the Mediterranean market. Iran can provide that and enjoy colossal Chinese economic benefits, its market, and its support. So that's the bigger picture. And then at the end, you talk about, quote, it was clear that Washington is militarily capable of invading any country in the Middle East, but it can't keep its forces there for long. The, quote, management of savagery attributed to Al-Qaeda and speaking about how to create a failed state and take advantage by moving toward the leadership of the country was more applied by the U.S. establishment than by the jihadists who wrote about it. And then you talk more about just the overall, the fact that Middle Eastern countries are unable to unite politically, economically, and militarily. And in your summary, last paragraph, you say, quote, the U.S. believes that it can corner Russia, China, and Iran. Russia has a 7,000-kilometer border with China. Iran is not Iraq, and Syria is not Afghanistan. In Syria, the destiny of that a world would be ruled by unilateralism is over. The world is heading toward pluralism. So the Syrian war is a microcosm of a much bigger global struggle. Zbigniew Brzezinski, in his Grand Chessboard book, which a lot of people refer to for high-level geopolitical strategy and to explain what the United States is doing, he talked about there being a window of time after the collapse of the Soviet Union where the United States could be the sole superpower. And then that's also expressed by Wes Clark in a more specific thing, where he says that, he gives us a little peek into what the strategy was post 9/11, again talking about a window of time during which the United States could move in the Middle East and overthrow governments and do regime change and install governments that are friendly to us and will implement our agenda. But they recognized that it was only going to be a window of time. It wasn't going to be sole superpower and global dominance was not something that was going to be able to be maintained in perpetuity. But at this point in time, it seems like we are at that point where that window has closed. But there are people in the United States, very powerful people, who are unwilling to acknowledge that. And I think that's what you get at here in the heart of your article is, do these people who have great influence over our war and foreign policy, do they understand that it's over? And are they willing to now accommodate other rising powers? And if they don't accept that, well, then it sets us an inevitable war with not only Russia, but Russia, China, and Iran, assuming that this alliance between China and Iran and Russia is as strong as you portray it here in your article. Am I getting that right, pretty much, or am I way
Yes. What I want to say is the details of the war in Syria today is completely irrelevant, really, because now we understand that the U.S. has lost the war, that the Saudi Arabia and Qatar have also lost the war with the U.S., and the regime change is over. And the regime change was not about Syria, it was not about the dictatorship, because most of the countries in the Middle East are run by dictators. And the best ally of the U.S. are dictators. If you look at all the Gulf countries, tell me which one has been elected by a democratic elections. Therefore, it is not a question who's ruling Syria. It is a question of how the U.S. was able to cripple Russia. So when I spoke to high-ranking Russian diplomats in Syria, they said until 2010, 2011, we just said the general understanding of the relationship with the U.S. was we are not interested in what's happening in the Middle East. The U.S. wants the Middle East, they can have it. This is why Medvedev gave Libya to the U.S. and has accepted to see the U.S. creating a failed state with the help of Europe in Libya. And that was fine with the Russian. And that was fine with the Russian until up to 2015 in September, when they have decided to interfere. But they have not decided to interfere because of Syria. They have decided to interfere because of Ukraine. And Ukraine, when you cut the gas, the Russian gas on Europe, it means you cut Russia's legs. And this is when Putin said, no, now we move in and we counterattack. And according to US assessment, Russia would have been on its full capacity in 2020. So what they have done is try to delay this from happening in 2020. They wanted to happen much later. So they were trying to surround Russia with all the military bases and to convince the former ex-Soviet Union countries to join NATO and to join them. And they have managed in many places, but not in others. So what they have done in Ukraine, they've lost Crimea, and Crimea went to Russia for free when Russia used to pay billions of dollars for renting the naval base. And this is when what I describe as the Russian bear woke up from its hibernation by the U.S. stick that was trying to wake up the Russian bear, and it has started in Ukraine. And in Syria, it was the biggest opportunity for Russia to intervene. And I can share with you something today, that when the Russians intervened in Syria, they were not very serious in taking back all the Syrian territory. They just wanted to stop the war and to create pockets all over Syria. That was the Russian plan. And that went against the Syrian government in Damascus and against Tehran and its allies. And that was a tactical and a strategic detail that the allies, Syria, Russia, Iran, didn't agree. And they were discussing, and they reached nowhere, because the Russians saying, I want to end the war and I want to keep good terms with the Americans. And even when Obama said, I'm going to bomb Syria, that before the Russian intervention with the jet, the Russian went to talk to the Americans saying, look, we're passing on a message from the Iranians. The first Tomahawk that's going to fall in Damascus, the second hit will be hundreds of missiles on Tel Aviv. So if you want to do that, this is what the Iranian message is. So that stopped the process of bombing Damascus. And until that point, Russia playing cool with the US. Now, when Turkey downed the Russian jet, this is when Putin went completely to phase two, that is to become much more aggressive in Syria, because Russia understood that this is not a Turkish move. This is a NATO move. This is a united decision from the US and its allies supporting Turkey and thinking Russia would think twice before attacking Turkey. It's a NATO ally. We have 50 nuclear bombs in Enzerlik airport, and Russia is not going to attack Turkey. But what Russia did, it did not attack Turkey, but it's killed a large part of the Turkish proxies in the north of Syria and cleared the area of Latakia, rural Latakia, Kasab, and all that area, and destroyed the Turkish influence in that area then, and then imposed financial strain on Turkey. So they have moved from saying, okay, we want to play fair with the Americans. And then John Kerry and Lavrov agreed to stop the war.
Right.
And Russia agreed to down all the Syrian jets and stop the Syrian army from bombing jihadists and rebels. But who the Syrian government needs to be thankful for is the U.S. establishment, who refused the foreign secretary's deal and wanted to aggress Russia even further in Syria, and they wanted to gain, or they want to win the war in Syria.
Right, that was a real turning point.
And they wanted to remove what they thought they wished they can. But Russia was ready to be on the defensive side and responding. And if you look at Ghouta today, the Ghouta came after the U.S. attack on Deir ez-Zor and the attack ISIS. So it is always a tit for tat. It's always a reaction. Russia is not taking the initiative. So what's happening now in the world, we can see that thanks to the Americans' mistakes, we see a very clear allies forming between China, Russia, Iran, and all this, let's call it axis, that is rejecting what the U.S. General Votel said, Russia is preventing us from dominating the Middle East. So the U.S. wanted the domination over the Middle East. So we're no longer talking about Hajar al-Aswad and Yarmouk. These are very small details. We're no longer talking about Ghouta. This is a very dot in a bigger map. It's nothing. We're talking about who is going to prevent the other from dominating. And the Russian prevented the U.S. from crippling the Russian economy by taking the Qatar pipeline through Syria by moving away Russia from Syria, preventing it from having the right to drill oil and gas in the Mediterranean and in Al-Badia, and to create, just to make sure that the Americans are going to stop somewhere. So now what the Americans have done, instead of keeping the Russian away from the Middle East, they have invited Russia into Syria, and now we have a Russian base for 49 years in Tartus. We have the Russian fleet in the Mediterranean, in the warm water. We have China there too, and we have Iran benefiting from all that and making a deal with Russia on how they're going to distribute the gas through the Mediterranean Sea and to give it to Asia and Europe. So therefore, what we're seeing today, we saw the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that was formed by the Chinese, and they did that in 2001. We have the China and Russia went even beyond that, and they formed the String of Pearls, and the String of Pearls just to make sure they surround what the Americans were trying to surround China. So they made a larger circle around it, and they went into all the area to include Asia, the South China Sea. They went to Sri Lanka, and they went to the Arabian Sea, and they went to the to make deal with all of this string of pearls to make sure they're not going to be cornered. And not only, they even have established now a very ambitious plan that is called the Silk Road. And the Chinese Silk Road is providing a link between Beijing and the world, which is estimated of a cost of $900 billion to $1 trillion. And that will relate China to Europe and will create a railway, will create a maritime link. So China is no longer surrounded by the Americans because the Americans have the upper hand in the water and they have a biggest fleet and they can control the water. But with this, China, Russia, Iran, and India, Pakistan, they are consolidating this front to say to the Americans, you are no longer dominating the world. You have a good army. You have maybe the best army in the world, but you can occupy any country, but you can't stay in this country. And we saw you in Iraq. That's a very small example. We're seeing you in Afghanistan. In Iraq, it was a question of weeks, and the entire Iraq fell in the hand of the Americans. And after 7 or 8 years, the Americans was leaving with 4,500 dead and tens of thousands of wounded. No, they can occupy, but they can't stay. And not occupying and not staying, it leads nowhere but to increase the financial burden on the U.S. And I don't think the U.S. finance are very good these days. And I think China is prevailing, and Russia, with its alliance with China, are going to be a super financial power, having also on board 4 or 5 nuclear countries like India, Pakistan, and Iran, and they have the economy dominance. Today, China responded to the U.S. sanction. The U.S. sanctioned China and imposed new taxes on steel and aluminum. China responded by imposing taxes on 120 items, including food, vegetable, etc. So China is no longer waiting to receive the hit. The Americans, they don't understand today that the era of the 90s and the 2000 and 2010 is over.
Yeah, some of us do understand it, but clearly some don't. And they're more powerful than the ones who do understand it, which makes for a very dangerous situation.
There is a small comment that just you mentioned about the management of savagery. And the management of savagery is a book written by the ideologist, the Salafi jihadist ideologist. You call them Al-Qaeda or ISIS. It is exactly the same. It's the same line. So it has been written before ISIS, and it has been written by Al-Qaeda, one of Al-Qaeda religious man, who believes to run a country is to create a disorder and a mess in a country where there is a kind of a failed state and where the jihadists can expand. Well, this is what the Americans have used after the George Bush second term. So instead of going to war with their own men, to Iraq, to Afghanistan, they've started to use the local population. And this is why I said after 2007, 2008, the number of U.S. casualties dropped tremendously in Iraq. And by using proxies and using the jihadis, we saw that Obama was aware of the growing of the jihadis and their plan to move from Iraq to Syria, and how the world allowed jihadists to land in Syria and consider it as a land of jihad, and they were encouraging, and the Americans didn't cripple ISIS finance for over a year of bombing. On the contrary, ISIS became much stronger. So all that is using failed state, like in Libya, when they supported Benghazi. The Benghazi is the base of the Islamists, is the base of the radicals, to support the failed state and rule over non-states in the Middle Eastern area. And this is the management of savagery. I think it was written by a jihadist, but it was applied by the Americans.
Yeah, that's interesting and tragic. One question I wanted to ask you. Right now, since Trump said we're going to leave Syria very soon, some troop numbers are being thrown around again, and the claims are being made in all the mainstream media that there are 2,000 American troops in Syria. I think those are the ones that are publicly admitted to. What's the general consensus over there as to how many American troops there are in Syria?
Well, 2,000 troops to control 40,000 square kilometer. It is possible because the British controlled India with a very small number. But they have many military bases. And if we divide the 2,000 over 15 to 20 military bases, then we see that in every one they have to leave 100 men. If it's feasible, yes, why not? But the problem is why would the US would leave northeast Syria, and they are building so many military bases and two big airports, and they are protecting ISIS. Why they would leave the area? I mean, the Americans know very well that if they leave northeast Syria, the Syrian army will eat up ISIS in agreement with the Iraqi army on both sides of the borders without crossing in each other border, and they will destroy ISIS immediately. And then the Kurds will be submitted to the Syrian government, mainly because they have accepted, supported, and protected a foreign country occupation of their territory. Is that the American plan? We see their presence in Manbij is increasing, and they continuously sending messages, we are here. Now, it doesn't mean that they can't pull out from one day to another. They can. So, honestly, I can't answer this question.
Mm-hmm. And it's probably not a simple answer anyway. There will be U.S. troops. There will be other NATO troops. There'll be the contractors. You know, we use a lot of private security contractors and, you know, contractors that do other kinds of jobs.
But the French and there are British bases in the area as well. It's not only U.S.
Yeah, the two recent deaths last week was a U.S. soldier and a U.K. soldier, and the news article said that the U.K. soldier was embedded with the U.S. Group. So I thought that was interesting. But let me try to wrap up here so I don't keep you any longer. Tell us about the book that you are writing.
Right. Thank you. Well, I'm struggling a little bit with the event in that book, but I mean, it's going well. I'm just trying to say that in 1982, Hezbollah was not born in 1982, despite the manifesto that was read in 1985. And Hezbollah was born in 1991 when Nasrallah took over the control of different part of what used to be called Hezbollah Bekaa Valley, Hezbollah South, and Hezbollah Center. And in my book, I'm going through the history of Hezbollah as I personally observed it and lived it on the ground. So just basically, I was there when the first manifesto was read in the suburb of Beirut. I was standing in the street and I talked to the two people who were present on the stage, one of them reading and another one who was behind him. And I walked along talking to Hezbollah official leaders, fighters, decision makers throughout the years to understand how this group was created, the history of Hezbollah, the present of Hezbollah, and the future of Hezbollah. I was also there in 1982 when Israel was bombing the Cité Sportif in the capital Beirut. I went there and I saw the bombardment, and that was the beginning of the Israeli invasion. I talked to the Israelis in the street of Beirut when I was walking during the Sabra and Shatila massacre. I was there too. I went to the camp. So I'm telling all my personal first-hand experience story about how Hezbollah was born much before 1982 or 1985, and who is Imad Magnier, who is Mustafa Badruddin, what are the things that Imad did much before 1982 or the attacks against the US and French barracks. I'm also talking about a little bit about Nasrallah. I'm talking about the decision of Hezbollah to go to Syria or to go to Iraq or wherever they're going to go, they are going to go. It's not a question of Syria or Iraq. It's a question of ideology. And I explain more in details the lack of understanding of Wilayat al-Faqih that forces Hezbollah, that adapts this ideology to support all the oppressed in the world. So it doesn't matter if it is Syria or Iraq. Wherever Hezbollah needs to be present is going to be present. And I talk also about the 2006 war, where I was in the suburb of Beirut. I lived the 33 days in the suburb of Beirut. I have a lot of unrevealed details about what Hezbollah did during the 33 days and how Hezbollah was feeling, what are the strong and weak points, how, for example, Israel bombed Imad's office only after 15 days and why. So all these details that I've lived in person, in firsthand, are going to be in my book.
That's great. That sounds great. I look forward to reading that. And I will include in the show notes links to Elijah's, it's a crowdfunded book, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Right.
And it's just to tell people that journalism can be free. We don't have to abide by the newspapers or the media's policy. If we don't have money, and we don't have money, journalists are very badly paid, at least from my side.
Yes.
And we can do things and we can share our experience and we can share our knowledge. We don't know everything, but we know something, and this something has some value, and we're going to share it. And I'm extremely grateful for all who are supporting the writing of the book and are funding it, because it makes a lot of difference. I am free to write everything in the book, and I don't have any boundaries.
Exactly. Independent media, support us.
Thank you.
Yes. Let's see. I really feel like I have kept you for too long. So is there anything else that you'd like to say before we wrap up?
I want to say that the war in Syria is over. These are tactical details. it's important to understand the biggest picture, that the Syrians have been used by all the players in the area, and they have been used because they have allowed themselves to be used for various reasons. If they stop, then they can reconstruct their country. They don't need the US and the EU money. The Syrians are very brave people, and they are extremely skilled, and they can construct anything. And the burden they can carry, the work they can do, no one in the Middle East is as strong and as capable and as skilled as the Syrians. We see them working in Lebanon, we see them working in other parts of the Middle East, and they want Syrians because Syrians they have much more capability than others. And they will reconstruct their country with or without the US and EU money. But they have to stop selling their country to foreign powers.
Okay, well, as always, thank you so much, Elijah. We learned so much from you. And stay safe, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you very much, Joanna.
Okay. Good night.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
And that's our show. Thank you for listening, and a special thank you to Elijah Magnier. Follow Elijah on Twitter at EJMAlrai. So that's EJMALRAI. Find his work at ejmagnier.com. Consider helping his crowdfunding effort for his new book at GoFundMe, and you can find that link in our show notes. Follow us at Around the Empire on Twitter. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and to our podcast channels at iTunes and other podcast apps. We're independent media, so we rely on your contributions. This podcast is brought to you with the help of our generous donors. You can help with that by going to patreon.com/aroundtheempire, or by doing a one-time donation using the links on our website, aroundtheempire.com. See you next time. Take care.